I'm Ksenia, and thank you for joining me here at my astrology channel, Guiding Star. It is lovely to have you with me. This is a very special report that I have been researching and preparing for quite a while now, and I wanted to share with people because it's very pertinent to, I believe, the energies that we're going through on the planet at the moment. But not only that, the energies that we will be rising up into for the next few years. The energy of what is at play and what is influencing us. Now, as we know, everything is cyclical in the universe. We work on cycles. Saturn has a roughly 28-year cycle around the sun. Jupiter has a 12-year cycle around the sun. The moon has a 1-month cycle around the Earth. The Earth has a 365-day cycle around the sun, and so on and so on. Everything is cyclical. We move in cycles, and our lives reflect that when we take the time to observe and notice and pay attention to the influences. What I want to talk about here is a very powerful 500-year cycle. If I want to get really specific, 558-year cycle. But because of the large nature of this cycle that I want to talk about, we're going to be looking at influences that took place over an extended period rather than just a pinpointed day. We're going to be looking at what has been influencing us for the last 500 years. Now, why I want to go into this, it's a very interesting story. Many of you will know I work with the most amazing shaman. She is my shaman. She works on my site for me. Tessa is amazing. And it was through knowing Tessa that I was alerted to a prophecy that's a very public prophecy. It's not anything private. I'm not treading on any toes in talking about this prophecy of the Incan people. And it's a 500-year-old, maybe even longer than that actually, prophecy regarding the earth and the people of the earth and the state of humanity. I want to start this video by looking at this prophecy and exploring this prophecy. Now, I'm going to read it to you. This prophecy is available on the Incan Medicine School site. I'll put the link in the description below, so you can go there and read it for yourself, but I will read it out loud, and I'm going to cut to some video footage because I'm sure you don't want to just sit here watching me read from a piece of paper. So we'll cut to some pretty video footage to entertain you while I read you this rather extensive Incan prophecy that's a 500-year based prophecy. From the website of the Inca Medicine School. The Quero Nation are the last Incans who were in hiding for over 500 years from the Spanish conquerors, keeping and safeguarding sacred Incan knowledge and prophecies. These prophecies relate to the return of the Pachacuti, a monumental time of change where order and harmony will be re-established on Earth, ending times of chaos and disorder. These prophecies are known throughout the Andes and are now coming true. Pachacuti, or Pachacutec, was the name given to the 9th Incan emperor who lived in the late 1300s. He was said to have built Machu Picchu and was the architect of an empire the size of the United States during an era of great transformation. For the Incas, Pachacuti was a spiritual prototype, a master or luminous one who stepped outside of time. Pacha means earth or time, and Kuti means to set things right. The name means transformer of the earth. When the Spanish conquered the Incas 500 years ago, the last era of Pachacuti, or Great Change, occurred. The change, sadly, was the destruction of the Inca world, yet the Incas had already predicted this change by looking at the stars. The Quero Nation knows that there is another Pachacuti coming, and they have been waiting for this moment ever since the last Great Change. This time they know the change will be for good, when the order will emerge out of chaos. For the past 5 centuries, Quero masters have preserved their sacred knowledge, and in recent years many signs have shown that the time of great change is at hand. These signs include the high mountain lagoons drying up, the condor becoming nearly extinct, and the discovery of the Golden Temple, which occurred following an earthquake in 1949. The prophecies are optimistic. They refer to the end of time as we know it, the death of a way of thinking and a way of being, the end of a way of relating to nature and to the earth. In the coming years, the Incas expect us to evolve into a golden millennium of peace. The prophecies also speak of tumultuous changes happening in the earth and within our psyche, of redefining our relationships and spirituality. The next Pachacuti, or Great Change, has already begun, creating the opening of another dimension again, and it promises the re-emergence of a new human after this period of turmoil. The paradigm of Western civilization will continue to collapse, and the way of the Earth people will return. Even more importantly, the shamanic elders speak about a tear in the fabric of time itself. This presents an opportunity for us to describe ourselves not as who we have been in the past, but as who we are becoming. It will be an opportunity with the potential for change for good. According to Dr. Alberto Vidaldo, the return of the Pachacuti is taking place on the collective level. This tear in the fabric of time will offer us the possibility to leave all old concepts and perceptions of time and space in the past. These changes give us the potential to recreate ourselves in a completely new paradigm. The Andean elders advise us not to lose this beautiful opportunity, because if we are able to give up the limiting concepts that we have around us, we finally will be able to see the splendor of what we can be. We will begin to understand what the Incas knew, that indeed we are seeds of the divine light, seeds of God. It is not the return of a single individual who embodies what we're becoming, but a process of emergence available to all peoples, says Americo Yaba. Americo Yaba refers to the Pachacuti time as the time of the new seed, explained as the new humanity that will be able to perceive the universe in a radically different form. In her book, La Transformación hasta el 2012, Elizabeth Jenkins describes part of the prophecy that was mentioned. When the melting of the snow starts in the sacred Ancastein mountain, they, the Quaro, have to go out from their towns because the earth needs their knowledge. Now that the snow has started to melt, the Quaro elders have arrived to share their knowledge with their brothers and sisters, their earth family. They are leaving their villages to share and to help us understand and remember the fundamental principles on which the Incans and other ancient and wise cultures based their civilizations. One of these fundamental principles is Ayani, or universal reciprocity, which, when implemented on a larger scale, will bring peace and unity consciousness. Now, we all know that the earth is changing. We're all seeing that. The Incan prophecy speaks about that happening. It's a fabulous piece of work, this article all about their prophecy. And it's amazing because we are seeing the shifts in the earth, not only the shifts they spoke about in the Incan prophecy, but look at what's happened in 2020. We know that we are on the verge of a rise into enlightenment, or an up-leveling, or a spiritual and energetic shift and change, and we can see it playing out amongst humanity. I don't know about you, but with all these lockdowns that I've been seeing at this time, what's come out of that is a tremendous awakening of people to the corruption that is present, to the ulterior motives that go on in political systems. And so people are having, eye-opening experiences, and as such, then they're looking to, well, what is truth? What is real? What is at the core here? So big awakenings going on in the hearts and lives of individuals as well as in the collective. That's obvious for us all to see now. But when I read of this prophecy, the first thing that entered my mind, the first questions that came to my mind was, well, what was happening 500 years ago? What was happening that in the world at large? What were some of the cycles? What were some of the influences? What were some of the effects that were playing out in the world that caused the Incan shamans to retreat and take their sacred knowledge with them? And we know, because everything is energy, that what was affecting them would not have been affecting them alone. When the cycles hit, the energies of the planets hit, they affect the whole world. Now, the Incan shamans observed what was going on in their society and their culture, and then they made changes according to that. But what else was happening around the world at this time that was, in effect, the same kind of reflection of what the Incans were experiencing? That was my first question when I read of this prophecy. Okay, well, what else was happening in the world at that time? And my second question was, what were the planetary cycles? Where were the planets at this time? And how were they impacting what was going on in the lives of the Incans, but also in whatever else was happening around the world at this time? So these are the two questions that I want to explore in this particular video. And stick with me on this. Some people might not be so into history, but history for an astrologer is very important, because history tells us what we experienced last time we had a certain cycle of activation, and therefore what we can expect in this cycle of activation when it applies to us again. So an understanding of history is almost an imperative to be a good astrologer, I feel. So we want to look at the history and we want to look at the cycles, and I want to just tell you right now, as you can see from the Incan prophecy, these cycles are starting to play out again, and we have been experiencing the beginnings of these cycles I think long before the Incan people started to return. I think these cycles we've had the flashes of light regarding the prophecy about to manifest for probably about 100 years now. So we'll talk about why that is, and what cycles we're looking at, and the influences that they are bringing, and what it means for us now, and what it means for us especially in the next couple of years, particularly up until 2023 and 2024. So 500 years ago, what was happening in the world? Well, we know that the Spanish were conquering the Incan societies, the Aztec societies, the Mayan societies in search for gold, looking for prosperity, on a hunt for, the yellow stuff. And they were decimating these indigenous populations at the time. They actually, I'm just looking at my notes here, the indigenous civilizations were depopulated by 80%. That is enormous. It's been argued that this was the first large-scale act of genocide in the modern era. The Spanish conquest of South America and Middle America. They spread foreign diseases, and that was usually how a lot of people died. A lot of Aztec and Incan and Mayan leaders were devastated by foreign illnesses, sexually transmitted kinds of diseases and colds and things like that they'd never been exposed to before. Now, according to one source on Wikipedia, it claims that the Spanish conquest was responsible for 1.5 to 2.5 million deaths. And that was aside from the tens of millions of deaths in the New World because of disease. So essentially, let me put that in layman's terms, 1.5 to 2.5 million people died by the sword or by other means aside from disease and infection that was brought by the Spanish to South America. Rudolf Rummer, he is a professor of political science. He claims that 2 to 15 million indigenous people were killed in what he calls democide, government or culturally caused murder in the colonization of the Americas by the Spanish. Terrible racial injustice and overthrowing of race based on a hunger for gold, essentially. Now, in the same era, around this time, now obviously the Spanish conquest of Latin America, that occurred over a period of time. It began roughly 500 years ago, and it went on for a couple of hundred years. But the cat was thrown amongst the pigeons around 500 years ago, which is what caused the Incans, the Quaru nation, to retreat up the Andes and to preserve their culture, to preserve their knowledge and their heritage. What else was happening around about that time, within let's give it a framework of say 80 to 100 years, because we're talking about big cycles here, slow moving cycles. So their influence often starts with a little trickle and then built to something phenomenal. In the same era, we saw Heinrich Kramer. Heinrich Kramer. I try and keep my cool as I talk about this guy because I utterly detest this man. But he released a publication called, in English, Hammer of Witches. Now, this is, in my mind, a disgusting publication. And it advocated for the extermination of what he called witches. And look, witches had existed prior to that time, but they got, they were around and people practiced. Well, a witch was essentially someone who practiced herbalism or studied the stars or worked with the cycles of nature, not some evil entity. We have it all wrong. But witches, male and female witches, existed prior to that, and that was a collective term, the term witch, used to describe people who worked with the cycles of nature, which is what we do as astrologers, herbalists, naturopaths, people who use herbal remedies for things. This was the banner that witches were sort of grouped under. And they were around long before Heinrich Kramer. But in 1486, Heinrich Kramer released this publication, Hammer of Witches, calling for the termination by torture and killing of anyone who practiced witchcraft. Now, this Hammer of Witches sort of, it, if you want to use the term, elevated sorcery to a criminal status, equivalent to that of heresy. And the Catholic Church was just getting its dominance on, its control on, its fingers into political pies quite extensively by this stage. And heresy was punishable by torture and death. And so by elevating sorcery to the level of heresy, meaning that people who practiced witchcraft or sorcery were against the Catholic Church, which was not at all the case, but he alleged that was, that then drew the punishment to the same level, torture and death. Now, Hammer of Witches, I'm just going to read here, it recommended torture to effectively obtain confessions and the death penalty as the only certain remedy against the evils of witchcraft. So if you're familiar with documentaries on this topic, you will know that a lot of people were tortured until they confessed, and then once they confessed, they were killed anyway. So, you could be tortured for days on end through horrific means, often highly sexualized means as well. Torture devices that, look, I don't want to go into all the graphic, gory details, but that were very sick and sadistic, basically, to satisfy the perverted nature of the people usually doing the torturing. And more often than not, it was women, some men, but mostly women. I'll talk about statistics for that in just a second, who were tortured as witches. And of course, they were afraid to confess because it would ultimately mean they were killed. But also in confessing, there was this added threat in that if you confessed, your whole family would also then go through the scrutiny of torture or death. So not only if you confessed, even if you'd done nothing, if you confessed, then you would pretty much face certain death, plus your family would also as well. So you were damned if you did and damned if you didn't. In fact, they didn't really allow much room for you to, deny any association with witchcraft or sorcery. It was very unjust, very imbalanced, and need I go on? Sorry, I get my blood boiling. I'm sure I was probably burned at the stake in a previous lifetime. In fact, I have no doubt, which is why it gets my blood boiling in this lifetime. Now, this so-called book had a strong influence on culture for several centuries, but it began around this time. And some people estimate up to 9 million deaths occurred throughout the world because of this. We're talking like with the Spanish conquest of Latin America and the witch trials and witch hunts. We're looking at, upward of 25, 30 million people who died because of what happened, the events that were instigated 500 years ago. My God. Now, a little bit about Heinrich Kramer, for those of you who really want to know. He was a priest of the Catholic Church, and he was, to coin a rather crass expression, he was tied as a fish's ass with the Pope. He was in with the Pope, and that's what gave him his power. And Pope Innocent very ridiculously named, Pope Innocent took his side, basically, and allowed him to get away with everything that he got away with. So he wrote this hate-filled tirade, Hammer of Witches, which was essentially a tirade against women, to be honest. And this occurred after he'd been expelled from the city of Innsbruck, and he was dismissed from practicing his priesthood there by the local bishop. And the local bishop considered his behaviour senile and crazy, to quote it. And he observed Kramer's senile and crazy behaviour in how he conducted himself regarding the sexual habits of one of 7 women that he chose to interrogate and prosecute for witchcraft at the time. This was before he wrote Hammer of Witches. He was on the trail then. So obviously he had a lot of sexual hang-ups. He was very much against women for a start. So there was some serious senile and crazy, as the Bishop of Innsbruck said, behaviour coming from this guy. I mean, I don't know much about his private life. Obviously, if he was a priest, he probably wasn't married. But whether he'd had rejection from women or whether he had just experienced difficulty with a mother or something like that, I don't know. We can only assume, but we don't want to assume here. We want to work on facts. So what we do know is that he had a set against women. I think that because of what was written in the Hammer of Witches, because of the Bishop of Innsbruck's assessment of him as being senile and crazy, because he was known for being obsessed with the sexual habits of one of these 7 women that he was prosecuting, we can safely assume that he was some kind of a sicko who got off on power and control, maybe sadism and perversion as well, especially with the kind of tortures and so forth that he recommends in Hammer of Witches. Look, we still see a lot of this stuff being covered up by this organisation today. I live in Australia. We have a cardinal from Australia who has recently gotten away with horrific abuse of children and recently been returned to the Vatican. So go figure, like, has much changed in that sense? Not really. We still see a lot of these perversions being covered up and supported by the high-level people in this organisation. Now, due to Kramer's ties with the Pope, as I said, he was in with the Pope, he was able to persuade the hierarchy of the Catholic Church at this time to, despite having been dismissed from Innsbruck, to continue to persecute and investigate cases of so-called sorcery and witchcraft. And this came under the authority of something called the Papal Bull, which is like an official Catholic document. So thus began the tirade of horror, of sexism, of torture, of sadism, of violence and complete injustice that was unleashed on Europe for the next 3 to 4 centuries, in fact. And we still see hang-ups about it today. I mean, if you talk to my parents about witchcraft, they immediately, their default mindset goes to, senile old women with hooked noses and warts and stuff, stirring cauldrons and throwing in frogs' legs and what have you. There's this mindset about what it is to be a witch that comes from those times, and there is still that energy that is pervasive there. Now, most of these persecutions were directed at people of the lower classes in European society, although there were quite a few, actually, cases, obviously not as many as the persecuted peasants and the persecuted lower classes, but there were some incidents of high-ranking individuals who were accused as well. Usually people who dared to oppose Kramer. So other priests who were stripped of their priestly robes or their position of authority because they stood against him. They stood for righteousness and justice and fairness, and because Kramer was in with the Pope, and the Pope obviously didn't have a lot of discretion, these people lost their positions as perhaps righteous purveyors of religious belief or what have you, in his railroading and his bulldozing of the good for the sake of his sadistic hang-ups. Anyone who tried to oppose him with intellectual biblical argument as well was also sort of thrown to the wolves in many cases too. Not literally, I'm using that as an expression. Just stripped of their positions of power. So on the basis of a lot of this evidence now, Sacre and Callow asserted, and I'm going to read you here, that the typical witch was the wife or widow of an agricultural labourer or a small tenant farmer, and she was well known as having a quarrelsome and aggressive nature. So at the time, that was what really indicated that someone should be assessed as being a witch. So at one point during the Wurzburg trials of 1629, so a couple of centuries later, but when things had really got the go on, children actually made up about 60% of the people accused for witchcraft. Although this had declined to 17% by the end of that year. But how did society get so low and so perverse that 60% of people accused of witchcraft were actually children? Now, one scholar, Rapley, he claims that 75 to 80% of victims of these witch trials were women. So as you can see, horrific energy that was present in the world at this time. We've got this racism and racial annihilation that occurred in South America. We've got the aggression against women for practicing the sort of the hidden arts. And it's interesting to me, actually, when I think about the Book of Enoch and how the Book of Enoch wasn't known at this time, but it way back when, like the Book of Enoch dates back to the times of the patriarchs in the Bible. So we're talking like the times of Noah, pre-Noah. In fact, I think Enoch was Noah's grandfather or something. Enoch in his book describes the encounters of the angels with humans and how the angels delighted in human women and came and procreated with human women. Oh, that's in the Bible. But Enoch describes these angels teaching the women that they procreated with astrology, herbalism, use of metals, and makeup, and all sorts of skills and abilities that obviously the men did not receive. So there was a great deal of jealousy back in, a couple of 4,000 years ago at the time of the patriarchs, because women were receiving this knowledge, this wisdom. And to my mind, things for women we've been in a state of being maligned since then, because the men experienced, instead of working with women to learn from them and know about these things themselves, there was a state of jealousy over this knowledge that had been passed on to women. Interesting, just as a side note there. But moving on, what else was happening in the world at the time? This was not it. There was still more that was happening. I'm only going to touch on this one briefly. We all know a lot about this particular circumstance that began, and quite honestly, it sickens me to the core, along with all these other things as well. But the transatlantic slave trade began. So along with all these other issues that we've already talked about, South American racism, sexism against women, this blight upon human existence, the transatlantic slave trade began as well. Again, more issues of racism and racial dominance that was completely out of place and unjustified and unwarranted, obviously. And obviously we're still experiencing the repercussions of this blight upon human society and human existence today. In all areas, issues of race, issues of sex and gender, so much suffering, so much heartbreak, that really began in earnest about 500 years ago. Inequality, discord, and injustice that we are trying to emerge out of today. The Portuguese in the mid 15th century were the first to engage in the Atlantic slave trade, and this began in 1526. So a little after, only about sort of 40 years after Heinrich Kramer's Hammer of Witches was published, and that's when they completed their first transatlantic slave voyage to Brazil, and other European countries soon followed suit with this. So what an era of history the Earth has been through. When we talk about this prophecy of the Incan peoples, we look back at the history, we can see, yeah, it was a shitty time and things were really going to go in a massive downward spiral. So much bloodshed, so much injustice based on race, culture, gender. It's impacted humanity for generations, as we can see. Horrible. No wonder we're very glad to be able to read prophecies such as the one I read to you a moment ago, that heralds the end of this 500-year tribulation, I believe, that the Earth has been in. So let's have a look now astrologically at what was happening at this time. Let's look, I'm going to use the chart of 1486. As I said, it was around the mid to late 1400s to the early 1500s that we started to see these things being implemented and being undertaken on the Earth. So I wanted to pinpoint an exact year that I could use the astrology of as a general indicator. And so I've chosen the year that Hammer of Witches was published. This is a partial chart of where the planets were in 1486. In 1486, as I said, the Hammer of Witches was published, and also notably Aztec ruler, I hope I say it correctly, Tizoc, T-I-Z-O-C. Tizoc died of a disease born from European invasion. So it's kind of, to my mind, a good year to utilize for this analysis. Now, we're looking at the placement of the outer planets here. We're going to ignore Venus, we're going to ignore the Sun and the Moon and Mercury, because those planets throughout the year 1486, they would have done a whole circle. The Moon would have gone around 13 times. The Sun would have gone around once. Mercury and Venus gone around once. And Mars done his thing. They're a bit too quick moving to show any generational influence. And that's why we're using the outer planets, because once you hit Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, you're really looking at a generational influence of planets. And that's what we're looking at here. Big cycles that go for generations, that impact entire generations. So we're going to look at these generational influences, but there's more to it than this. I'm going to add more to this in just a second. What can we see just by looking at these generational planets for a start? Well, first we've got down here Jupiter in Capricorn. We'll start with Jupiter. Jupiter in Capricorn. Well, Jupiter, what does Jupiter rule? Religion. It rules other cultures. And Jupiter is the planet of religious belief, other cultures. Jupiter is a planet of moral law as well. And where was Jupiter in 1486? In its sign of its fall, Capricorn. Doesn't like to be in Capricorn. It's uncomfortable in Capricorn. It's where Jupiter's been all year this year as well. Capricorn represents governments, hierarchies, authorities. What did we see? Spanish government sending expeditions to Latin America. The hierarchy of the church, so Capricorn is hierarchies, Jupiter is religion. Religious hierarchies instigating the Hammer of Witches. Authority figures, the Pope getting his go ahead and start persecuting people on, And so Jupiter, the planet of the great benefic, I might add, but the planet of religion, moral law and belief, and culture, other culture, sitting in an uncomfortable sign of Capricorn. That's the first thing we notice. The second thing we notice, Saturn was in Sagittarius. It's kind of like double whammy of this influence during this year, because what is Saturn? Saturn rules Capricorn. So these two had swapped. This is what we call a Parivartana yoga, where the ruling planets of two signs swap places. In this case, Jupiter was in Saturn's sign, Capricorn. Saturn was in Jupiter's sign, Sagittarius. Now that's happened many times since this. It's not an unusual occurrence, but there was a lot more going on in the skies, which I'll talk about in a minute, that made this exacerbated. What did we see? Saturn representing authority, restriction, blockage in the sign of foreign places, and the sign to do with religions and beliefs. Again, authority with religion. We see foreign authority in foreign places coming in, restriction and blockage of people being able to practice herbalism freely and medicinal healing freely, and blockage of people perhaps even being able to travel freely, although there was a lot of obviously travel at the time with the the transatlantic slave trade beginning and so on. But Saturn rules slavery. So we've got Saturn in the sign of travel and foreign cultures. So there's another indicator. What else was happening? Uranus, for a good part of this year, it was sort of chopping and changing between Sagittarius and Capricorn. But Uranus, for a good part of this year, was in Capricorn. The unexpected, change, sudden shocks in hierarchical realms and religious realms and cultural realms, sort of doing his song and dance between the two at this time. So lots of the unexpected in terms of religion, the unexpected, like nobody expected that Heinrich Kramer's expulsion from Innsbruck would result in a vicious tirade that he published against women that then turned into centuries of persecution. No one would have seen that coming, but sudden upheaval, sudden shocks, like boom, out there is this suddenly published book, a sudden publication of a religious tirade, Uranus in Sagittarius, sudden beginning of a slave trade, shocks, right? Really, it's perhaps wasn't quite so sudden, but shocking kind of events. So peasants were free one minute, and the next year they're being persecuted for gathering herbs in the field, to use in tonight's dinner or something. So sudden shocks that bring change. Neptune down here was in Sagittarius as well. So you can see there's we could almost call it a bit of a stellium, but really to have a stellium, you need 4 planets in a single sign. When you've got the outer planets close together like this, it's a very rare occurrence, and it heralds mass societal change. And that's why we're experiencing mass societal change in 2020, because we've got Saturn, we've got Jupiter, and we've got Pluto. Some of these outer planets tightly together in Capricorn, and it brings in societal change. But this, I believe, is needed societal change we're experiencing this year. But here is Neptune. So these guys are all very close together in the chart. It wasn't actually a conjunction of 3 or more outer planets, but they were pretty damn close. Excuse me. Neptune, Neptune, when Neptune's aspected with difficulty, he brings deception in religion. And here he is in Sagittarius, deception in religion, deception in foreign cultures. Here he is in a difficult conjunction with Saturn. Like these two are like oil and water. Saturn is rules, restrictions, regulations, and blockage. Neptune is no boundaries, flowing with life, just freedom to be and do and come and go and so on. And they're exactly the opposite energies, Saturn and Neptune. In ancient mythology, Neptune's actually Saturn's son, so I don't know what that family culture was like, but hey. But here, in a conjunction with Neptune, as it was for most of this year, that's what we consider a difficult aspect to experience. So deception in the sign of religion, deception in the sign of cultures, deception from authority figures connected to religions and foreign cultures. So a lot of people being deceived here, a lot of people being martyred, a lot of people being disempowered. Neptune is a planet of loss of culture here. So, obviously people through hierarchies and governments infiltrating their cultures, loss of culture in Sagittarius, the Incan people retreating up the mountains to preserve their culture because it was on the brink of being lost under this influence. It's interesting though, because Neptune rules to retreat, to tap out of society. And what happened with the Incan people, as we talked about in this prophecy, they retreated. They tapped out of mainstream society for 500 years, waiting for the energy that began around this time to dissipate before they could return. Very, very interesting. Pluto, the final of the generational planets we mostly work with in astrology, was in Libra. Now, that's not unusual. In fact, I'm born with Pluto in Libra. Maybe that's why I'm drawn to do this video. Who knows? But Pluto in Libra at this time represents, Pluto is power, Pluto is control, obsession. And here it is in the sign of partnerships and contracts, agreements. But also it's the sign of our relationships with others. I don't think there's any coincidences there. Pluto, we're talking generationally, not in individual charts here. Pluto, at the time all of this was going da-di-da-di-da, Pluto in the sign of power and control and obsession over other people. And what did we see happening? The transatlantic slave trade, the annihilation of South American people groups, the control and dominance over women in Europe. Mostly women. I don't like to sort of just say women alone. Obviously children and men also suffered, and families suffered, relationships suffered and were traumatized. Like if you saw your mother being burned at the stake for being a witch, how was that going to affect your family and your relationships with men and women in the future? If you were left wifeless and had to raise your children on your own because your wife had been burned as a witch, how was that going to affect your relationships? And Pluto is trauma in the sign of relationships. So many families and relationships decimated by this power and control that was sought over other people, Pluto in Libra. That's how I interpret these generational planets and what they were doing around at the time in the year that Heinrich Kramer released his Hammer of Witches. I want to move into the next chapter of this video, not reading, the next chapter of this video, and I want to talk about the big 500-year impact. There are two things. There are two things here that need to be talked about. It's Chiron and it's Eris. We need to talk about Chiron and Eris. And this is where it gets pertinent to where we are at today. Here's Aries. Now, Chiron, in this year, 1486, Chiron, I'm just going to draw him on. I don't have a symbol of Chiron, so I'm going to draw him on. Chiron was at 12 degrees of Aries. So that's Chiron right there. Okay. Chiron, just for people who aren't familiar with what and who Chiron is in the skies, let me give you a bit of background. He's the wounded healer. That's what everybody knows him as. So he orbits the sun. He's been classified as a number of things like a minor planet. He's been called an asteroid. Look, it's found that today he is considered by some as a comet, but he orbits between Saturn and Uranus, and he was discovered in 1977. But we know, because we can calculate astrologically, that in 1486, he was here, 12 degrees of Aries. Yeah, he is a class of objects astronomically known as centaurs. That's bodies orbiting between the asteroid belt and the Kuiper belt. The asteroid belt is between Mars and Jupiter. The Kuiper belt is beyond Pluto. So this is Chiron. This is what he is astronomically. Now, mythologically, Chiron was a centaur. That means half horse, half man. He was injured and he was never able to recover fully. But he used the knowledge that he had the knowledge about his wound, so the mythology goes, to go on and help others. Let's look a little bit deeper at this mythological influence. He was the wisest of all the centaurs. He was very focused on nurturing the young and up-and-coming minds of Greek legend. He was a teacher, an instructor. He was the son of the Titan Kronos, Saturn, in other words, and Saturn's relationship with the Oceanid, I hope I say this correctly, Philyra. So he was the result of that union, but the Kronos turned himself into a horse at the time he made love to Philyra, and of course then what was born out of that was a half man, half horse. Chiron, he married Chariklo. Now there's been a lot of discussion in astrological circles about Chariklo. Plenty of information sort of getting out there now about Chariklo if you want to know more about Chariklo, who was married to Chiron, and together they had 3 daughters. Let's go back to Chiron's mythology. When Chiron was born, his mother Philyra looked at him and went, "Oh, yuck, rejection." Rejection is an issue with Chiron, and she abandoned him. She was disgusted in his appearance, disgusted in him. And so what happened to poor old Chiron in this state of rejection from his mother? He was orphaned. Well, it wasn't all over Red Rover, because Chiron was then embraced by the beautiful god Apollo. Apollo embraced him, took him under his wing, taught him the art of, I'm reading here, taught him the arts of music, archery, gymnastics, herbalism, interesting, medicine, and prophecy. These were all things understood by Chiron. Now, Chiron's skills and abilities reflected the influence and the capabilities of his adopted father, Apollo. And it was Apollo that helped Chiron embrace so much more than his animal nature. Remember, he was half animal, half human. Apollo's influence on Chiron helped him be more than just an animalistic beast. He refined him, he gave him culture, he gave him knowledge and skills and abilities. So he became more civilized through his, even though he was rejected, he became more civilized through his adopted father, which is a beautiful story, I think, a gracious story. In the ancient Greek mythology, centaurs were often painted as being a bit depraved, a bit animalistic, notorious for being wild. I'll read here, lusty, big drinkers, prone to violence when they were drunk, uncouth, uncultured. That was the general impression of centaurs. Chiron rose above that. Chiron became more than that. He left his animal nature behind and became one of the wisest and most revered of the centaurs. He was intelligent, he was civilized, known for his knowledge and his skill with medicine. He was credited with the discovery of botany and pharmacy, the science of herbs, science of medicine. Very powerful influence in the mythological circles. Now, he had a very peaceful character. He was kind, he was intelligent. And these attributes were also attributed to the influence of his foster father Apollo, and also his foster sister Artemis as well. So he was a great healer, he was a great astrologer in mythology, he was a respected oracle. Chiron was said to be the first among the centaurs. Now, as you can see, brilliant energy, Chiron, brilliant energy, the epitome of nobility. He actually gave up his immortality. Remember, he was a child of the gods, and he willingly, according to one version of the mythology, gave up his immortality in exchange for the life of Prometheus, who had stolen fire from heaven to give to human beings, and was then chained to a rock as punishment, going to be sort of killed by, I think it was the Lothian, I think, that lived in the sea. Or Prometheus was destined to die chained to this rock, and in exchange for his life, Chiron gave up his immortality. So a gracious being, Chiron, beautiful energy. Now, according to one version of the mythology, after he had been so gracious and given up his mortality, he was accidentally shot in the foot or the ankle of an arrow belonging to Hercules that had been dipped in the venom of the Hydra, a mythological beast, and this lodged in his foot. And so this is where we get the fact that Chiron could not heal himself, because his immortality had gone and he was susceptible, as human beings are, to these kinds of things. And so the master of the healing arts was unable to heal himself. The mythology, the story ends quite beautifully, though, because of his nobility, because of his graciousness. His half-brother, Zeus, who was also a son of Kronos, took pity on him and placed him in the stars of the heavens as the constellation of the centaur, Centaurus. So if you're familiar with the constellations in the sky, he's not only the asteroid Chiron, he is also represented by the constellation of Centaurus. So that's a bit of Chiron information for you there. Let's take a look at what I feel is the most telling influence on this chart of 1486. And this is Eris. I'm going to talk about Eris. Here was Eris in 1486 at 21 degrees. Chiron at 12, Eris at 21 degrees of Aries. Chiron and Eris together in Aries. Where are Chiron and Eris at the moment? Together in Aries. Let's firstly, before we talk about that, have a look at what Eris is all about. Well, she's a Kuiper belt object. So she sits out there with Pluto. She is a dwarf planet. In fact, she is the most massive and the second largest known dwarf planet in the solar system. So she's bigger than Pluto. She's more massive than Pluto. And she was discovered in January 2005. And in 2006 was when she was named after the Greco-Roman goddess of strife and discord. We'll talk about her mythology and therefore her influence in just a minute. But her cycle is 558 Earth years. That's how long she takes to do a cycle around the zodiac. 558 years. When does that take us back to? 1486. Or thereabouts. Remember when we're talking about the outer planets, particularly, Pluto and Eris, we're looking at generational impacts that last ages. I mean, Pluto has been in Capricorn since 2008, and he will be there until 2024. That is how long his influence in Capricorn is having effect. When we get to Eris, it's even longer. The influence is extensive because she is so long in a single sign. She takes 558 years to go around. That's more than double what it takes for Pluto. Pluto does 2 circuits of the horoscope in the time that it takes Eris to do 1. And so she's in a sign for like years and years. The influence is felt in that realm for years. So her cycle is long. Her influence in a certain realm of the horoscope is profound and powerful. We know how powerful Pluto is in a single sign because he sits there for so long, impacting that energy for so long. Anyone who's had a Pluto transit knows that it's the most powerful transit that you will go through. Most transformative, most changeable, because its influence is just so intense. Eris is doubly intense, and Eris is even more so. So here is Eris. Let's find out a bit about her. Well, she was the daughter of Zeus. Remember, Zeus was the son of Sutton. Okay, and the daughter of Zeus and his wife Hera. Eris herself bore a son named Strife, and so Eris, goddess of discord, and her son Strife would often go into battle together to war alongside her brother Aries. So let's get the picture straight here. Aries was her brother. Eris, discord, goddess of discord, and had a son Strife. Now, so they would all go into battle together. They were kind of warriors, fighters. this family. Look out, wouldn't they be fun to be around? But the most important myth concerning Eris that I want to share with you was the one where that was purportedly the cause of the Trojan War. So a lot of people who've done a bit of study about Eris will know about this, but all of the people on Mount Olympus in Greek mythology had been invited to the wedding of, now who is it, Peleus and Thetis. Don't know who they are. Haven't studied their stuff yet. I'll let you know when I do. But anyhow, these two guys were getting married, and so they held a wedding. They actually ended up being the parents of Achilles, interestingly. A little side fact, Achilles was trained by Chiron and was present at the death of Chiron, actually, as well. But anyhow, so this wedding was taking place on Mount Olympus. Eris was not invited to the wedding because these guys didn't want her around because she always seemed to bring trouble. She was the goddess of discord. So everybody else was going, but Eris wasn't. Sounds a little bit like Maleficent in the story of Sleeping Beauty, doesn't it? So she was insulted by this. And as a means of revenge, discord came anyway to the party because she had got together this golden apple, threw it into the party, and on the apple was written, a bit like Snow White, if you like, to the fairest in the land, so to speak. You know, you'll know the story of Snow White with the apple and the queen who wanted to be the fairest in the land. So in comes this apple, thrown into this wedding feast, this wedding party, to the fairest in the land, written on it. And the three purportedly most beautiful goddesses at this wedding feast saw this apple, to the fairest, and they started to fight between themselves about who deserved this amazing apple. Now this was Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. And Zeus decided he was going to appoint Paris, the prince of Troy, to make the decision about who should get this amazing apple. Now, all of these goddesses, they offered Paris gifts, promises of benevolence and abundance and what have you. But Aphrodite, she offered Paris Helen, the wife of Menelaus, the king of Sparta, as his reward if he was to choose her as the fairest in the land. And as I say, the rest is history. Sparta and Troy went to war, and all over Helen, wife of Menelaus, whom Paris was in love with. And Aphrodite got her apple, but at what cost? So that is probably the most famous myth about Eris. But modern astrologers who've been researching the influence of Eris since she's been discovered, and there's still so much to learn, I might add as well. We've only known about her since 2005, but they have discovered a great deal more to her than just someone who liked to stir up trouble. And modern astrologers who've been studying her, they concur on a number of points about Eris already. And I'm going to read to you here. She's not just about she's not just about revenge and strife and discord. Rather, her tone implies justice where there is injustice. She is a fighter, yes, but she only initiates battle when she has no other choice. This is the observation of the energy of Eris. Her passion springs from the will to live, to initiate from the very fire of existence. So she's a fiery energy, and no wonder she stirs things up, especially when she's in the sign of her brother Aries, the fire sign. So Eris is known to have a tendency to strike anger and jealousy in the hearts of men. Sound familiar to Heinrich Kramer, anybody? Now, I want to paraphrase one of the astrological researchers of this particular astral body, and I'll paraphrase here. She is a powerful symbol of both human consciousness and the natural balancing of the karmic universe. She embodies the essence of willful action and choice. She provides us with the temptations of human life, greed, lust, revenge, and holds us all accountable for our decisions. She reprimands us only if necessary when we have acted in ways which violate higher truth and order. Eris is a cosmic catalyst for spiritual shifts similar to that of Pluto. Well, as we know, in 1486, the apple of discord was thrown into humanity, and we were presented, or some people were presented with greed, lust, power, and so forth. We have been accountable for those decisions that were made at a collective level ever since. So that's where Eris is coming from. That's the energy of Eris and what she brings. Now, as I said, we're still observing her influence. It's still early days, but these are the substances that of her energy that astrologers are beginning to concur on. Now, what's interesting is that Eris and Chiron have not been together in this sign since the era of 1486. Now, it wasn't exactly 1486 because obviously Eris was at 21 degrees. She'd been there for quite a few years already, and so had Chiron, because Chiron takes 50 years to do a circuit. So he'd been there for a couple of years already. He sort of spends quite a while in a single sign. But it is roughly 500 years since these two have been together in this sign, and now they're back together again. Aries, the sign of self-orientation. Aries, the sign of initiation, beginnings, and being spirited. Chiron, the planet of healing the wounds. And Eris, the planet of justice and discord. So we've got healing and wounding, justice and discord, back in the sign of war and initiation. What does all this mean? Well, last time we had these two together in the sign of Aries, what did we see? Severe issues of race and gender, religion, colonization, impacting society on Earth, humanity on Earth. So it is time, they're back together again. It is time to up level from where we were 500 years ago now. As the Incan shamans have said, Eris threw her apple in 500 years ago. We've had 500 years odd of repercussions of this, and now it's come full circle. The cycle has come full circle. It is time, Chiron, to heal this energy. It is time for justice for what was begun 500 years ago. The time for justice is now. The time for healing is now. And that's why these two in Aries are so important. I want to look now at where we're heading. So through the magic of editing, I'm going to include the current chart, the chart of 2023, which is a year we're all heading towards. And I want to have a look at that in relationship to this 1486 chart. Isn't the magic of modern editing amazing? Here we are with a very interesting chart to look at. Now, I hope you can all follow me with this chart so that we can understand the themes that we are looking to play out in 2023. I believe that we are heading into a time when we're going to progress out of this 500-year influence. Now, the shamanic prophecies indicate this, but astrologically, we're seeing it in the sky as well. This is a time basically of karmic retribution for what was done then, and we have the chance to up level, to go beyond. So I wanted to look at the chart of 2023. On the outside here, we've got where the planets were, which we've discussed already. Also, these were where the nodes were, I should add as well. That's where the planets were in 1486. In 2023, this inner circle is where the planets are going to be. We've got Pluto in Capricorn. We've got Saturn and Neptune in Pisces. And we've got Jupiter and Uranus in Taurus. And still, we will have Chiron and Eris in Aries. Let's take a look at what this means. I'm using whole sign placements. For those who are not familiar with whole sign astrology, please do check out my video on my YouTube channel that goes into great detail about how whole sign astrology works. It is such an effective ancient system, and to my mind, it works better than anything. So check it out. We're not looking at house placements here in these charts because they're not relevant. We're not looking at a single moment in time. We're looking at big generational influences here. So this is the chart of 2023 in here against 1486. What are the general influences we can notice here? We have the same repeating patterns. And when we see repeating patterns happening in the sky, we know it's a powerful cyclical revisiting of what happened when we had this pattern before. What is the pattern? Saturn and Neptune together. And this time it's in Pisces. But not only that, it's squaring where they were last time. Sorry, my pen's a bit dry. Squaring where they were last time. We have Pluto in Capricorn squaring where he was last time. Big influence, this square, tense, having to push through obstacles, energy. Not only that, but we also have Jupiter and Uranus. I believe our saving grace together in the same sign, but trining where they were last time, making a trine aspect to where they were back in 1486. So we have these repeating patterns in the sky, these repeating linkages. And we're not just talking about, oh, the sun's in the same spot as, no, that's fairly common. That happens once a year. These outer planet linkages are rare. The fact of like having Jupiter with Uranus, well, that happens every 12 years in the same sign. But having Jupiter and Uranus together in the same sign as in the same year that we have Saturn and Neptune in the same sign, just as they were back here in 1486, that's rare. Very rare to have these two together at the same time as these two are together. And lo and behold, they're making some pretty serious aspects. Two squares here, tension, something to be pushed through, something needs to be overcome, something needs to be endured, persevered through. And like I said, I often use the analogy of a rugby scrum where there's a square aspect. You've got to get down, your head's got to get in the game, and you've got to push with all your might to get through the blockage. That's the energy of this square aspect. But we've got the salvation here of the trine coming between Uranus and Jupiter. Sudden, unexpected things happening in a beneficial way because it's a trine. And Jupiter, benevolent, big, expansive and abundant change. This is our hope, guys, to up-level and leave behind the karma, the trauma of the past 500 years. It is happening. Now, as I'm recording this video in late 2020, we've already seen Eris and Chiron. They've already returned to the same degrees that they were at in 1486. That's already happened. So the unraveling of this energy from 500 years ago has already begun. And we've seen this prophecy of the Incan peoples, that's been in place for a little while now. We've already begun the collective healing of the wound. Chiron is to heal the wounds. Chiron healed the wounds of others through his medicine, through his herbalism, through his intelligence and his knowledge, even though he couldn't heal himself. We have to now work on healing the wounds that happened to other people, or maybe we're the reincarnation of the people who were wounded. We have to heal those other lifetimes now through our knowledge, our wisdom. What is interesting though, in 2023, Pluto is going to be at the final stages of Capricorn, his sojourn in Capricorn, getting ready for his move into Aquarius. And in whole sign astrology, what happens when he moves into Aquarius? He will trine his placement from 1486. So to me, 2023 is what we're building towards here. This Pluto is trauma. Pluto is suffering. And we are working through the tension to heal the trauma and the suffering at the moment. And then Pluto bang into Aquarius, trining where he was in 1486, the easy healing, the emergence into the blossom time, out of the underworld. Pluto is the underworld. We will emerge easily then out of the underworld into the potential, into the blossom time, into the springtime, into the healing, into the transformation that is promised as Pluto makes a trine to his natal position, while all the rest of these planets are repeating the cycle as well. And we have Chiron and Eris together in Aries still. Now, what's interesting is Eris and Pluto have been squaring one another all this year, almost to the exact degree, and they're going to continue to do so. What does this mean? This means, so we've got, I should explain this. Here is Eris, and here is current Pluto placement. And obviously, current Pluto placement sort of around 22 degrees here of Capricorn, and Eris is roughly around 21, 22 degrees. They've been making a square all year, all through 2020. Not a lot of astrologers have talked about that, but that has been a big influence on what's unfolding in 2020. It's powerful. There's been a lot of uncovering of old secrets, revealing inner demons, exposing the dark side of humanity, giving us a chance for Eris justice, karmic conclusions. Pluto is karmic healing of old wounds, giving us choice, giving us accountability for our actions now. This square that's been happening throughout 2020, I believe, marks the movement towards this astrology here of 2023. And obviously in 2023, I've already said it, but the interpersonal planets, Saturn and Jupiter, will join the celestial planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, to line up and address issues cyclically from 500 years ago. And they'll do it in new ways because they're in new signs here. They're not in the old signs of hierarchy and religion. Now they're in the signs of spiritual faith and belief, Pisces, divine intervention, Pisces, and the groundedness of Taurus, the connection with the earth, connection with the practical and the real. Now, obviously these wounds from 500 years ago that were begun, they can't be erased fully from our genetics. There's been a lot of scientific research that proves that we actually carry a lot of genetic imprint, and some of this stuff has been handed down for generations, for hundreds of years. Like I described earlier, the wounding done to relationships, the wounding done to families, children watching their mothers getting burnt at the stake, families torn apart by, fathers being exiled in slavery with the transatlantic slave trade, and so on and so on. These things are in the collective psyche now. These things are in the collective consciousness. They're part of our genetics in a lot of ways as well. So we can't erase those things. They happened. They occurred. We can't go back and undo it, obviously. But we get the chance to heal Chiron, the strife, Eris. So what's also very, very interesting with these cycles astrologically is the eclipses. Now in 2023 and 2024, they're going to powerfully activate this chart of 1486. Not because they're going to be returning to their natal spots. That's not what's happening. Instead, I should put them on the chart. Let's do a bit more editing magic. Ta-da! Here we are. So the nodes of the moon are going to be in the signs of Aries and Libra at this stage in 2023-2024. The north node will be in Aries, the south node will be in Libra. What are we doing? South node, leaving behind Pluto's power, control, dominance in that we described earlier from 1486, because that's where he was. And the north node, conjunct with the 1846 placements of Eris and Chiron, we're going to rise up into the justice of Eris from that time so long ago. We're going to rise up into the healing of the collective wound, Chiron's placement from so long ago. It's my belief that this outworking is actually the most profound thing that we're moving towards as a collective in the coming years. And of course, this is aside from Pluto's much anticipated move into Aquarius, which we are all really kind of looking forward to. the repeat of this pattern, the repeat and triggering of these points from 1486 and that era that started so much bloodshed and upheaval in the world, this is really what's going on. We're seeing an awakening of people on the earth. Yes, we're seeing up-leveling of people right now. But I think, that's part of it, yes, but I also think there is going to be some serious healing and justice that occurs. At least if we work towards that end, it can happen. If we look back at more recent history, Eris re-entered, Eris re-entered the sign of Aries, her brother Aries, in the 1920s. She's been in Aries for 100 years. This is how long she takes to move through something. So her impact is powerful for a long time in one realm of the chart. So here she's been in Aries since the 1920s. What have we seen? I'm going to refer to my notes here. The exposure of sexism, racism, pedophilia, dark religious extremism, this has been being gradually unraveled. This is what was established 500 years ago. And what's been happening since the 1920s, this stuff is being exposed. This stuff is being revealed now. And we're seeing it getting stronger and stronger and stronger, especially since Chiron has joined here and we've got these planets gearing up to move into this position. It's getting stronger now. We're building towards the culmination of the healing and the transformation. Let's think about where the world was in the 1920s across the board and look at just how far we've evolved in a relatively short period of history when we're looking at the big scheme of things. What happened in the 1920s? Women's fashion became less restrictive. Goodbye corsets, goodbye long skirts down to our ankles, goodbye all that stuff. Let's get out there and have fun. 1920s, the flappers, jazz music, cocktail parties. I mean, the 20s was a knee-jerk reaction to the horror of the World War, First World War years, but also Eris had moved into Aries, and we started to see the beginnings of freeing up for women. Women had got the vote about 15 years earlier than that. So it had begun, these cycles move slowly and the impact can sometimes be felt even before. And women had got the vote, but it really, women started to be freer and more liberated little bit by little bit by little bit by little bit from the 1920s. And it began with fashion. They had the vote, they had the right, they were beginning to get the right to own property, to have jobs, to earn equal pay. And, as time has gone on throughout the last century, divorce their husbands. All this has happened in the last 100 years, little bit incrementally, since Eris has moved back into Aries. This is just one example. We have seen people begin to be liberated from slavery in certain parts of the world to get equal rights. Now, we're not there yet by any extent for women, for racial justice. We're not there yet, but we're working towards it. And when we're looking at the last 100 years, we can see how Eris in Aries is bringing these things up again. Issues of race, issues of gender equality. In the 60s with Martin Luther King and that movement, and now the return of the shaman, again, bringing back their knowledge that they tapped out of society with 500 years ago. Not only that, but we are seeing shamanic practices and witchcraft, if you want to call it that, coming back into favor. Astrology is returning. Herbalism has been returning over the last 100 years. That's, more alternative medicines, chiropractic, reflexology, massage, herbal remedies over, synthetic medicines and so forth. Mysticism is coming back into vogue. The things that were squashed through Heinrich Kramer's hammer of witches 100 years ago are now returning and becoming more not mainstream, but more visible in society, more tangible, more experienced in society. This is what people were burnt at the stake for back in 1486. Now we're moving into a period where we are being freed from that. And in my mind, we have this chart that we're moving into more and more and more, 2023, 2024, to thank. And we have the return of Eris, who, yeah, she's about strife and discord, but yes, she's about justice as well. She's bringing justice back, fighting for justice for everything that happened 558 years ago. And Chiron healing the wounds alongside of her here in the sign of Aries. Now, it's not going to happen without the rugby scrum, the square aspects that I spoke of, getting down and dirty with it and pushing through and, persevering and enduring and maintaining our direction towards equality. But we're on the brink. We are getting there. We've come a long way in the last 100 years since Eris moved back into Aries for the first time in 558 years. Back in the 1920s, we've come a long way. And we're almost, I feel, there. But we're in the final push. Don't give up hope. We are nearly there. Pluto in 2024, moving into Aquarius, the sign of equality, the sign of justice. I feel we're getting close, and I want people to find hope in that, in the midst of all this upheaval of 2020. We are at the final stages. Keep going, people. Don't give up. Keep fighting for righteousness and justice, for fairness, and let's undo all the damage that was done so many years ago. The shaman are returning. The healing has begun. Chiron is doing his masterful healing, this time of the collective, and Eris has returned.